Welcome to part 2 of the Beyond Typicals video tutorial series. In this video, we'll cover the basics of Beyond Typicals, including a tour of the various menus and settings that you can use to perfect your 3D model. I'll also show you how to use the camera controls, save and load your projects, export rendered images and videos, and a whole lot more. Let's dive in. When you load Beyond Typicals, the first thing you'll see is our welcome message box, where we'll periodically post announcements and the latest Beyond CAD news. You can click the Close button in the top right corner to begin working on your Beyond Typicals project. The main menu can be opened by clicking the Beyond Typicals logo in the top left. The Help menu has some helpful information, including a Getting Started window. This window includes some user interface tips to help you familiarize yourself with key components and basic navigation controls. The Help menu also includes other good info, like a link to our free tutorial videos, plus a link to our Living Known Issues and Limitations document. You can also pull down the Help menu to see what version you're using, and also there's a link to purchase a subscription and remove your watermarks if you're running a free trial. The license pull-down has an Activate button, which pulls up the login box where you can type in your subscription ID. And for only our virtual floating license users, this menu also has a Logout button in case you want to free up the shared license for someone else's use. The Subscription Info button will show your active subscription details. You can see that I'm using a Beyond Typicals yearly floating license, and there's 283 days until my renewal. Before covering camera navigation, I want to cover spin bars, which are a vital element of the Beyond Typicals interface. Spin bars are just about everywhere in the program and help you customize a lot of different elements. I'm going to left-click on this middle section here to bring up our basic editing menu on the left, which I'll cover in more detail later. I'm also going to open the section length settings in the menu here on the right as well. And notice all these blue and gray bars with numeric values inside. These are the spin bars I'm referring to. These are just adjustable inputs for various settings, including the section heights and widths, camera controls, and other general settings. There are a few different ways to interact with the spin bar to adjust the value. For instance, for this 12-foot lane width, to change it, I can either click and drag on the spin bar to change its width, click on the left or right arrows that appear when I hover over the bar to incrementally increase or decrease the width, or I can left-click on the spin bar and then type in my own value and press enter to set a specific width. These spin bars typically have a minimum and maximum value, so if the number you type in exceeds that range, it'll default to the max or min value of that spin bar. These spin bars are virtually everywhere, and they can all function a little bit differently depending on the setting you're changing. So you might find some are best clicked and dragged, like a time of day adjustment. Some might be best adjusted incrementally, like a camera angle. And some are best as specifically entered values, like a 10.5-foot lane width. Camera controls are pretty intuitive, but they're very important when building your model and rendering outputs from Beyond Typicals. There's a few different options to move the camera around. I want to cover mouse navigation first. You can click and drag on the right mouse button, and that will rotate the camera around the model. You can click and drag on your middle mouse button, and that will allow you to pan the camera left, right, up, and down. If you scroll the middle mouse wheel, you will zoom the camera in or out. So an upward scroll will zoom in and a downward scroll will zoom out. And if you want to speed up this zoom, you can hold Control on your keyboard while scrolling, and that will zoom in and out even faster. We also have some keyboard controls to move the camera. You can rotate the camera by holding Shift and pressing the arrow keys on your keyboard. And you can pan the camera by holding Control with the arrow keys, or just pressing A, S, D, or W when no sections are selected. There are more camera controls in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. In the free camera mode, the camera remains still and lets you pan, zoom, and rotate the camera however you like. But you can also put the camera into motion by choosing either the orbit mode or pan mode. If I choose orbit mode, I get some additional options for the orbit distance from the model, the angle of the orbit camera, and the speed of the orbit. And you can see we can set the speed to a negative number to change the direction of rotation too. The pan mode is similar. It will automatically start moving the camera in one direction, and you can choose right, left, up, down, back, and forward as pan direction options. You can also set these directions relative to either how the camera is oriented or how the world or built elements are oriented. With a relative camera transform, forward is just straight ahead toward where the camera is pointing. But with a world transform, it moves forward along the section model. This mode also has a panning speed setting that can be modified. The camera also has a 2D mode. You can click this top right button here to toggle an orthographic camera and view your model in just 2 dimensions. You can look at the top, front, left, and right sides of the model, and you can use the camera pan feature similar to the 3D camera mode. Back in 3 dimensions, notice there is a field of view spin bar as well. This camera setting basically adjusts how wide or narrow the lens of the camera is. I generally find that a higher or wider field of view is more appropriate at a person level within the model, and a narrower field of view does a better job capturing the model as a whole from a more zoomed out perspective. Feel free to play around with this setting to see what works best for your model and your renders. The setting is critical for matching cameras in photo compositing, which is something that'll be discussed in more detail later in this video series. You can also see and adjust the location and orientation of your camera position by clicking the Settings tab in the camera controls. Here there are coordinate, angle, and distance spin bars, which can be modified to make specific camera adjustments like slightly upward along the z-axis, or pitched downward a couple of degrees, or adjusting the zoom distance. You can also save the current camera position within your project and reload it at a later time, which also helps with photo compositing and maybe making multiple renders from a consistent viewpoint. The render menu has a saved cameras section at the top, and there is a Save Current Camera button. Clicking this button will not only capture where your camera was positioned, but also the field of view setting, if it was a 2D or a 3D camera, and if it was panning or orbiting. You can save multiple cameras within a project, rename them if you want, and easily toggle between them. These saved camera positions are stored in your project file. So if you have a different save file and you need this same camera position there, you would need to head down to the Camera Settings tab, click the Copy button, which uses your computer's clipboard, and then open that other project and click Paste to load that camera position there. Then you could save that camera for that project file if you need to. Let's head back to the main menu and talk about the File and Edit tabs. Under File, you have options to start a new project, either with a blank model or with the default two-way left turn lane project that loads on startup. You can save or save as, and similar to other Windows programs, if you haven't saved yet, the Save dialog will pop up the Save As dialog, which will prompt you to pick a location and give your file a name. Then you'll be able to go back to File Save or hit Ctrl-S on your keyboard to save your file moving forward. Beyond Typical's models are saved as btip files, which is they have an extension of btyp. I'm going to save this file as example.btyp. As you use the program, desktop users may also find btypt files in their working folders. These are automatic backups of the save files you're working on. There's a setting that allows you to turn this off or adjust the interval for how frequent these backups are saved. And if you ever need to recover one of these backups, you can find the btypt file and simply rename the extension to btyp. Then that file can be opened in Beyond Typicals. Back in the File menu, Load will open a dialog box to open a btyp file on your computer, and pressing Ctrl-O on your keyboard does the same thing. The Export All Custom Assets button is a feature for saving out any customized dynamic or imported Beyond Typicals assets from your working file for use in other projects. This creates a BTA file and is something I will cover in more detail in a later video in this series. Lastly, back in the File menu, you can go to Recent Projects to see and load recent BTIP files you were working on, or you can quit the program. In the Edit pull-down, you can open a History panel on the right side of your screen, which is the same action as clicking the clock icon in the bottom right corner. Changes to your model are stored in this History panel, and you can click on certain actions to revert your model back to those changes. Plus, there are backward and forward buttons below the clock in the bottom right that are undo and redo actions. Undo and redo are also buttons in the Edit menu at the top. Plus, you can press Ctrl-Z to undo and Ctrl-R to redo on your keyboard for those commands as well. You can use the left mouse button to select objects throughout Beyond Typicals. Left-clicking a section will select it in the model, which then pulls up a section dialog box on the left-hand side. This dialog lets you make a lot of different changes to that section, like adding assets and underground pipes, or modifying the moving traffic, or changing the surface texture, which will all be covered in more detail in later videos. You can move a selection by pressing the left or right arrow keys on your keyboard. So after picking this lane, I can press right to move that selection to the right and left to move it back. This is usually the easiest way to select the stripes between the lanes to make edits to the spacing or color of that pavement marking. I usually click the lane next to the stripe and then hit the arrow key to move to the stripe next to the lane. If you left-click away from a section, it will deselect it and that dialog box will disappear. Selecting sections is also possible in the section hierarchy. You can open the section hierarchy using this button on the right-hand side, and that opens the panel where you can see a top-to-bottom list of all the sections and stripes that are placed left to right in the model. Left-clicking on any of these rows will select the placed section or stripe. You can also select multiple sections in Beyond Typicals, and while there are some great multi-section edits possible that will save a lot of time, like changing both of these lane widths at the same time, or making this whole road a concrete surface, this is a relatively new feature that has a few limitations depending on what you're trying to do. To choose multiple sections, you can hold Control and left-click on sections either in the model view or in the section hierarchy panel. You can also select one section, hold Shift on your keyboard, and click on another section to select everything between them. And this shift selecting also works in the hierarchy. You can also pick up and move a section in the model view by holding a left click on a section. When you do this, a brief timer will pop up, and if you hold for the full time, you are able to let go of the left button, drag the section somewhere else in the model, and left click to place again. If you right-click while in this move mode, it will delete the section. If you want to move these within the section hierarchy, this is simply a left-click and drag, and you can let go of that left-click to move it somewhere else in the order. I'm going to close the section hierarchy and take a full look at this toolbar here on the right. There's a lot of functionality here, and I'll get into this in more detail in this video and later videos, but I first want to give a brief rundown of what's contained here. At the very top, we have our Sections menu, and this is a palette of all the building block elements that you would use to pull into your typical section model to build the full width of your roadway. Below that, we have our example projects, which is a great starting point for a project, whether you want to start with a blank model or find something similar to what you're trying to build and use that as a jumping off point. I do a lot of work to show off a lot of different functionality of Beyond Typicals by building these example projects, so I recommend you explore these to get some inspiration and see all the things you can do, like bridge projects and construction staging and transit design and more. You can also click on the name of an example project, and that will bring up your web browser and load a YouTube video where we're describing that example project in a little more detail. Plus, you can click this More Example Projects button at the bottom, which will load a page where you can go get more example projects available on our website. Below that is the Assets menu, and this is our library of more than 500 different 3D elements which can be brought into the model in some fashion. And again, I will get into more detail about these in another video. Below that is the section hierarchy, which is that list of all the placed sections and stripes in your model. And below that, this red button is the rendering menu, where you can save your camera position, like I covered before. But this is also the menu you would use to create a screenshot or an animated video render of your Beyond Typicals model, and also where we house the photo compositing tool, which will be covered later in this tutorial series. The sun icon below that is the environment menu, which allows you to change some display options around your model, whether it's changing the time of day and sun rotation, or turning the clouds on and off, or changing some of the background gradient colors. The settings menu is where you can make some global adjustments, like disabling section labels, or modifying the section length, or switching from imperial to metric units. The Scene Effects menu has some adjustable camera filters, which can give an artistic flair to your model, like a ballpoint pen effect. And below that is the Phasing menu, which is an important one, which lets you create and store multiple typical section models in a single BTIP file. And this is great for before and after renders, or developing multiple design alternatives, or walking through construction staging for a roadway project. Below that is Layout mode. This is a view-only mode, which is used to view multiple phases at the same time in the model view. And at the bottom here, we have the History menu, which is that tracked list of changes where you can undo and redo through here. And at the very bottom of this menu, we have the Traffic Play Pause button, which can allow you to globally pause or resume traffic in place. And then also a Simulation On-Off button, which will just turn off or on all the moving traffic in the model. When you right-click a section, that section's selected and the Quick Action menu pops up. This menu contains a few different ways to manipulate that section when it's selected. You can see keyboard shortcuts for these actions, or you can just left-click on the action you want to execute. Quick actions include removing a placed section by pressing Delete, duplicating a placed section next to it by pressing Ctrl-D, surrounding a section with striping by pressing S, and this is my preferred method of adding striping in the typical section, as this action locks the stripe to that selected section and will stick to its surface as you move the section up or down, and when you move the section left or right, it will move with it. You can press Tab or the right arrow key to select the next section to the right, and you can use Shift Tab or the left arrow key to move your selection to the left. This is my preferred way of selecting the striping in the model, since they're difficult to select just by clicking. I normally click the section next to the stripe and then arrow key over to the stripe to either make edits to it or delete it. I'll mostly skip wrap with folder for now. That's a function associated with grouping sections together within the section hierarchy, which is a menu I will cover in more detail later in this video. You can flip a section from front to back by pressing F. This is a really quick way to flip moving traffic from forward to backward. And you can mirror a section from left to right by pressing M. I'll show the difference between flip and mirror with these trees here. Flip effectively rotates the section 180 degrees, so the trees move from the back left to the front right, while mirror just moves the trees from front right to front left. Remove, duplicate, flip, and mirror also have shortcut buttons at the bottom of the section dialog box here on the left. To round out this quick action list, you can copy and paste a section using Ctrl-C and Ctrl-V. This is a great way to transfer a section and its assets into another project file. Keep in mind there are also keyboard shortcuts for undo and redo with Ctrl-Z and Ctrl-R. Plus, you can move the camera with Ctrl plus the arrow keys, or rotate the camera with Shift and the arrow keys. And one last keyboard shortcut is you can press F11 to enter or exit full screen mode when using the desktop version of Beyond Typicals. Now I want to spend some time and dive into some of these toolbar menus in a bit more detail to show a lot of the functionality here. I'm going to save the Sections and Assets menu for their own videos in this tutorial series, since there's quite a bit to cover in each of those. So I'll first dive more into the section hierarchy and show everything you can do here. The section hierarchy lists all the placed sections and stripes in the model from top to bottom as they appear left to right on your screen. This lets you quickly find and manipulate the arrangement of those elements like lanes, striping, medians, curbs, etc. You can click and drag to rearrange the placed sections within the hierarchy. For example, dragging this median down the list will move it between two other sections to the right of its original place in the model. You can rename sections here by double-clicking on them, and you can delete them by clicking the trash can icon. If a section has this upside-down triangle on it, that means an asset was placed on that section. And when you select that section, you can see those placed assets in Model View, which have the Beyond Typicals logo over them. If you delete a section with a placed asset on it, the asset will also be deleted from the model. The icon is here in the hierarchy because assets may be moved away from the original section they were placed on. So I can move this fire hydrant over to the other side of the road, but it's still tied to this grass section on the right since that's where it was placed originally. Also, the chain icon is shown between sections and stripes. This button allows you to link a stripe to an adjacent section. When linked, you'll also see a yellow line between the section and the stripe in the hierarchy, and that link means the stripe will move with the section and won't move with the section when unlinked. You can also group these items in the hierarchy by placing them in a folder. You can either click the Create Folder button at the top of the menu, which places an empty folder at the bottom of the list, or you can wrap one or more adjacent sections in a folder by selecting them and pressing Ctrl F on your keyboard, or right-clicking and choosing the Wrap with Folder quick action. Other sections and stripes can also be dragged into a folder within the hierarchy list, and you can rename a folder by double-clicking on the folder name to help with organization. Now that there are a group of these sections in a folder, I have some additional functionality that can speed up my model editing. By clicking the folder name, I automatically select all the sections and stripes in that group. And on the left, there are some multi-section editing functions available, like changing the height or width of all the elements in this group, adding consistent area highlights and pathway arrows, or changing the surface texture of all these lanes. Keep in mind that some multi-section edits are limited depending on what section types are included in that group. Some sections have a preset minimum or maximum width, so some sections may not reach the full width you are trying to get to. Also, some things like surface texturing or adding primary or secondary assets may not behave as expected for the full selection if the group contains different section types. For instance, adding a cable barrier to the selection works for the two shoulder sections, but is adding a different asset for the common lanes in that section. Folders can also be duplicated and mirrored to help speed up the placement of a symmetrical roadway. You can build and wrap half a roadway in a folder, then right-click on the folder to duplicate that folder, and then right-click it again and choose Mirror to reverse the order in that other folder. Then, with some mirror and flip actions to change the moving traffic and pavement marking directions, I have a symmetrical roadway in about half the time. Finally, you can add folder labels within the section hierarchy. Each section generally has an auto label in the model, but sometimes you may want to replace individual lane labels with a grouped label, or even just add an additional grouped label over those individual labels. Let's explore this by creating a shared use path with 4 3-foot wide bike lanes next to each other away from this road. I can adjust the primary asset on some of these bike lanes to people walking, jogging, and riding scooters. That'll show a diverse group of users moving at different speeds next to each other. But the issue here is I have separate labels over the top of these 4 sections. So what I can do is place all 4 of these bike lanes into a folder, then select that folder and turn off all the individual labels in the section auto label properties, which I'll cover in more detail in this section's tutorial video. Then I can click this folder label button in the hierarchy, which brings up a menu in the lower half of that panel that lets me enable a folder label and modify its text, style, and position. The folder label dimension will dynamically update if you adjust the width of the elements inside that folder, and the label can also be manually widened, narrowed, or overridden if necessary with additional settings in the folder label property list. The section hierarchy not only keeps your models organized and make things easier to find, select, and edit, but mastering folders and multi-section editing and grouped labels is going to make building sections faster and ultimately gives you more control over your model's layout. You can access environmental settings by clicking the sun icon in the right-hand toolbar. These environment settings affect the appearance of your model, such as turning on or off the gradient background, turning on or off clouds in the sky, adjusting the density and height of those clouds, and using inner and outer gradient colors to change the background color of your model. In many of our example projects, we use a natural light blue sky background, but you can make changes to this, like making the model look more generic with an all-white background, or setting your project apart by using some colors that will pop, or match a certain branding for your project. Clicking these left arrow buttons will revert the inner and outer gradient colors back to the light blue default color. You can also adjust the sun settings, including moving the time of day on a 24-hour clock with this spin bar, or changing the rotation of the sun to affect the shadows on the street, and changing the sun's intensity level. And while nighttime scenery has some limitations, you can accomplish this by changing the time of day to 0 or 24, then changing the background gradient colors to black. At this point of version 3 of Beyond Typicals, the cars don't have headlights that come on, but you're able to place emissive orbs of light into the model from our Assets menu. You can place these near streetlights and the headlights of vehicles to make a nighttime scene look more realistic. The gear icon in the right toolbar opens the global settings of Beyond Typicals. There are a lot of different sections in here, so I'll cover them from top to bottom. First, we have the visibility settings. In here are some display toggles. First, you can enable or disable the clipping of assets at the front and back edge of the model. This includes vehicles that enter and exit the scene. You can see how when clipping is turned off, these cars just appear and disappear instead of gradually appearing and vanishing when that clipping plane is enabled. Also, some of the other assets will clip at the front and back edges when clipping is enabled. I'll disable clipping and then move this tree forward. You can see the tree in front of the front edge of the section, but when clipping is enabled, the tree disappears beyond that front edge. Some assets are pre-programmed to clip and others aren't, like this pipe segment, so this setting may not affect all the assets in your model. You can also globally turn off section labels with this checkbox. Note this doesn't affect the custom labels I've placed in here. This toggle is just a great shortcut if you want to render something without any labels, or if you want a base image or video where then you can add your own labeling in a different tool after you create the image or video render. There's a toggle for these overhead section labels to cast a shadow or not. This is off by default. Then there's a nanite toggle. Nanite is an Unreal Engine setting for some of the 3D assets in Beyond Typicals, which is designed to improve the performance and frame rate of your sections while modeling. When nanite is turned on, the quality or resolution of some of the 3D objects will dynamically adjust depending on how close or far they are from the camera. For instance, the 3D grass in Beyond Typicals has a lot of polygons and detail and is usually the biggest culprit of low frame rates or crashing when there's a lot of it in your model. When nanite is enabled, some of these assets will lower in resolution or may even disappear, like this grass here on the sides of the road. You can see that when I disable nanite, the rest of that grass appears, but the frame rate has slowed down and Beyond Typicals is less responsive. Nanite is generally on by default for better performance, but when you render images or videos, it automatically and temporarily turns off so that your outputs capture the full detail and resolution of those assets. You can view your frame rate with the Show FPS toggle. This is a display setting that will pop up a box in the top middle of your window to show the current rate of frames per second that Beyond Typicals is showing on your screen. Here you can see that when I turn off nanite, that FPS rate drops and then picks back up when nanite is re-enabled. Lastly, there's this Show Missing Assets exclamation point setting. This is a display setting for missing custom assets to indicate that there was an asset placed somewhere in the model that is no longer available in the speed tip file. Dynamic assets and imported assets are something I'll cover in more detail in our assets video, but for now I'll show that if I delete this person waving and these repeating red streetlights from the dynamic templates in this file, those assets are still shown on the sections, but replaced with the red exclamation point. The visibility setting lets you hide those exclamation points without removing these assets from the section. While each lane of moving traffic has individual traffic settings for things like speed, volume, and type, there are also global traffic settings that may be useful for some projects. The pause traffic and disable traffic options function the same as the traffic play pause button and simulation on-off button in the bottom of the right toolbar, pausing or turning off all moving traffic with a single click. Override show stop signs and stop bars are toggles that control the global visibility of traffic stop markers, useful for seeing where traffic stops are located in the model. Stopping traffic is something that will be covered in a later video in this series. The traffic speed multiplier is like a fast forward or slow motion slider and will speed up or slow down the display of moving traffic by the multiplier set here. Now, I want to point out that most commonly, Beyond Typicals users will customize the moving traffic on a lane-by-lane basis, selecting that individual lane and editing the traffic on the left-hand side of the screen. These section settings will be discussed in more detail later in this video series, but there's also global traffic settings here on the right, which allow you to override or globally change those lane-by-lane settings. The speed setting in this menu is a place to globally adjust the speed of moving vehicles all at once. For example, setting it to 65 miles an hour and clicking Apply to All will update all moving vehicles to that speed. Similarly, the volume setting adjusts the frequency of vehicle generation. A value of 0 stops moving vehicles from being generated, and a value of 1 means each section will generate one vehicle and wait for it to clear before generating the next. And any higher values will increase vehicle frequency on a sliding scale up to 100. Now, each lane has a setting that can defer its vehicle mix to the global traffic library by enabling this Use Global Traffic toggle. When turned on, the vehicle mix will use whatever is activated in the global traffic library shown on the right. The Set Global Traffic All and None buttons toggle this setting for the lanes with moving vehicles, but use this with caution as it can override individual section settings in places that may not make sense. There's just a few more traffic settings here below the global traffic library. There are pedestrian gender and ethnicity distribution settings, so you can adjust the distribution of men and women and ethnicities to match a specific demographic for the people that are walking through the section model. Then there are intersection timings, which control when vehicles are stopping and starting, and similar to stop bars, this is something I'll cover in more detail later in this video series. And finally, there's an advanced traffic settings pull-down with a display frame rate just for moving traffic. By default, this is set to display animated traffic at a rate of 120 frames per second to make sure that animations appear as smooth as possible when viewing and rendering your sections. You can see if I lower this frame rate, the moving traffic gets very choppy, so this isn't a setting you'll likely need to adjust from its default 120. Moving down the settings list, we get to Units, where there's first a toggle to hide the units of measurement globally in the section labels. Then there's a drop-down selection to change from the default imperial unit system to metric units. This globally adjusts the units throughout Beyond Typicals, including the section labels, height and width inputs, traffic speed inputs, and more. And one more note on units. In most cases where you see an X, Y, and Z location coordinate setting, these units are typically in centimeters regardless of the global unit system. So moving an asset upwards in the Z direction by 30 units would be raising it 30 centimeters, or just short of 1 foot. This applies to the X and Y position of underground pipes and bridge substructures as well. In the next section, you have the ability to change the section length of your project file, which is 100 feet long by default for new projects. To change the length, just click and drag the spin bar or type in your preferred length and then click the confirm button to change the section length. You can adjust the length to as long as 1,000 feet or as short as 10 feet, and any section length less than 50 feet will stop generating moving traffic. Any traffic you see when shortened below 50 feet is just a set of cars that had already been generated on the longer section, and once those clear, no more traffic will appear. A couple of notes here. For one, you cannot curve this section. Beyond Typicals models are limited to straight line representative segments of road, bridge, or transit corridors. And two, for section types with 3D grass, lengthening the section beyond 100 feet currently requires some manipulation of the grass asset to stretch from front to back. The easiest way to adjust this is to move the grass forward on those sections with a longitudinal offset, then adjust the x-axis scaling and spacing until it reaches far back enough to the back edge of that section. You could also place individual sections of grass from the Asset menu, which clip at the front and back edges of the model. Every Beyond Typical section has a center line, which is hidden by default. In the section alignment settings, you can see that center line by toggling off the Hide Center Line setting. This center line is normally located in the mathematical middle of the built section elements, but if you need to adjust the center line, perhaps when building an asymmetrical section, you can move the center line left and right by adjusting the center alignment spin bar. Another note here, when the X and Y coordinates of the camera settings are at 0, rotating the camera will rotate around the center alignment. But once you shift away from that location, the rotation shifts as well. The Orbit camera mode also orbits around the center line by default. Next, there is a Lock Outer Sections toggle, which allows you to force the leftmost and rightmost sections in your model to a static position. This feature can help designers build their sections to a pre-established width, like between right-of-way lines. When you toggle this on, the center of the outermost sections will move to a set position left and right of the center line, which can be controlled with the left and right section position values. For this section, which is 108 feet wide, toggling this on will take these sections with grass and trees and shift them out of their snapped position on the outside of the model to a point where the center line of this tree section is a set distance away from the center line. I can increase this right section position to 60 feet, which creates a 10-foot gap in the model that I can fill with other elements. This feature can be used in conjunction with our right-of-way lines, which I can put on the outer edges of this section, set them to 0 feet wide so they don't add any width to my section, and then lock them at something like 33 feet left and right of the center line. Then deleting any sections in the middle will then help me build a road section that stays within that right-of-way width. Keep in mind that if I shift the center line alignment, those locked right-of-way lines will move with it. Toggling the setting off will bump those right-of-way sections back to the outer edges of the model. The next setting group is called width bounds, which is another way to display a constant width constraint when building your section. To turn this feature on, toggle on the Show Width Bounds box, which displays a labeled width visualizer over your modeled elements. The boundary width is something you can set to help establish a width constraint, either for designing to a set width or communicating this set width as part of your visualization. You can change this width with the boundary width setting. I'll type in 60 feet and press enter. And now any placed sections that exceed that 60 feet are highlighted in red. This red highlight can be turned off by toggling on Hide Visualizer. And the width bounds label is fully customizable, so you can move the label up and down, forward and back, left and right. You can change the font and color, turn on and off the leader lines, and even override all the dimension text. Keep in mind that the width bounds label will remain centered on the center line, so you can adjust the section center line alignment to show an asymmetrical width boundary if needed. The total width setting controls a label that dynamically displays the total width of all the placed elements within the model. This label is usually on by default for new projects, but can be turned off by unchecking the Show Total Width toggle. And similar to the width bounds label, this total width label style and text can be completely edited as needed. The last setting here is auto backup for desktop users or auto save for cloud access users. I'll cover auto backups for desktop users first. This feature automatically saves a backup and restore point of your current working session on a regular interval. By default, this is turned on and backs up your working file every 15 minutes, but this can be turned off or the interval can be changed by adjusting the frequency setting. When Beyond Typicals backs up your working file, it saves a btypt file in the folder where your btip file is saved. This btypt file gets overwritten with each backup and is there in case you forget to save hours worth of work in Beyond Typicals before closing accidentally or experiencing a crash when working. If this happens, you can rename that btypt file extension to just btyp, and that file will be openable in Beyond Typicals. If you're working on a new project that hasn't been saved yet, Beyond Typicals will attempt to place a time-stamped btypt file in your Windows Documents folder. For cloud access users, this feature is renamed as autosave, as instead of creating a btypt file, it just saves the btyp file and sends a copy to your downloads folder, as it does with all save files and render outputs. Moving down the right side toolbar, we have a few scene effects that apply an artistic overlay to your model. This includes a blueprint effect, where you can adjust these spin bars to change the opacity of the white lines on the blue paper, the opacity of the paper, and the scale of the grid lines on the paper. Plus, you can change the width of those white lines as well. There's also a crosshatch scene effect, which applies a black and white hatch over the model, where you can adjust the opacity of the filter and the hatch size with these spin bars. And finally, there's a ballpoint pen scene effect, which shows your model drawn on a spiral notebook, where you can adjust the blue line and white paper opacity, plus change the paper scale and line width. The phasing menu allows you to create, store, and quickly navigate between multiple typical section models in a single Beyond Typical save file. This is extremely useful for projects with multiple design options, like this wide highway alternatives example project with a few different options for a wide transportation corridor with expressway and surface street options. It's also great for showing different typical sections along a corridor, like this urban complete street reconfiguration with an existing condition model plus a base design between intersections, along with a phase for showing how that base design needs to change at bus stops and left turn lanes. Phasing is also great for walking through a series of construction stages, or visualizing a before and after scene. This example project does both, with the before and after phase of a small downtown streetscape improvement, but also shows the life cycle of the reconstruction, with new water main and protected walkways through the construction zones. Keeping all these different models for one project in the same file keeps things organized, makes editing easier, and it allows you to easily navigate through and view these multiple phases from a consistent vantage point. In the phasing menu, you can create a new empty phase by clicking the blue button at the top. After clicking that button, a new phase is added to the bottom of the phase list, and clicking on that phase name shows the new blank model. You can also start from a copy of an existing phase by selecting that phase and clicking the Duplicate Current Phase button, which creates a copy of that phase and moves it to the bottom of the list. I can rename that phase by clicking in the phase name box in the phase details section, adding a new name and pressing enter. If you want to delete a phase, then select that phase and click the delete phase button at the bottom of this menu. You can also reorder these phases by clicking the white up and down arrows left of each phase name in the phasing list. A very convenient way to navigate between multiple phases is this Display Floating Phases toggle, which when activated shows a set of buttons at the bottom of the screen for each phase stored in this project file. I can then just click those buttons at the bottom to move between phases instead of having this phasing menu open to do that. You can also set Beyond Typicals to automatically cycle through the phase list by turning on the Display Auto Phase toggle. That pops up an auto phase interval box in the bottom left, where you can enter an interval and a number of seconds where your project file will move through phases automatically. This works while the camera is in motion, either with the orbit or pan modes, and this could be useful for recording a video that automatically switches between phases to show all the stored options or construction stages of your project in a single render. Finally, you can display the name of the phase by toggling on Display Phase Header, which shows the name of that phase in large text at the top of the screen. Layout mode is a view-only mode that lets you see multiple phases in a single view. You can enter this mode by clicking the blue Enter Layout Mode button at the top of this menu. Then click Create New Layout, which adds a new empty layout to the list. Select that new layout to start adding to and editing the layout. You can choose any of the available phases listed at the bottom of this menu to see them in model view. And as you continue to add phases, they will be stacked vertically as multiple layers. The layer list at the bottom lets you change the order of the phases by clicking the white up and down arrows, and you can remove a phase from a layout by clicking the trash can icon to the right of the phase name in the layer list. You can change how far apart these layers are separated by adjusting the layout spacing spin bar. And you can toggle on and off the phase name labels by clicking the Use Labels toggle. If you leave the labels on, you can adjust the height of those labels with the label positioning setting. And you can also increase or decrease the size of the label or change the label font with additional settings. The Label Occlusion toggle adjusts whether the phase label can be seen in front of or is hidden by the modeled elements. And the Face Camera toggle adjusts whether the phase labels always face the camera when the model is rotated, or if the labels align with the front edge of the section. When in layout mode, you're locked from making edits to sections, but you can adjust your camera settings, change the environment, and render images and videos from this mode. One tip I've often helped users with is using this mode as a workaround to stack multiple elevations on top of each other. For instance, in a section with a bridge that runs parallel over a roadway, I can have the lower roadway section in one phase and the bridge section in another. Then use layout mode to place the bridge over the roadway and adjust the layer spacing until they fit together. A key element to this is that the phases will all stack on the phase's center line. So if I needed to see the bridge off to the side, I could change the center line alignment of that road phase, then head back to layout mode to see that bridge shifted to the side. While Beyond Typicals can be very useful in real time for concept development and editing, project coordination, and decision making, it also has rendering capabilities to export high-quality static images and animated videos of your transportation project. You can get to the rendering menu by clicking this red circle in the right-hand toolbar. As a reminder, this menu also has the functionality to save and load camera positions at the top, which was covered earlier in this video. To render an image or video, you'll first need to pick a place on your computer where you want these files to be saved. To do that, click the Pick Output Folder button and navigate to or create a folder where you want these exports to be saved. I'm going to head to my desktop and create a new folder called Render Tutorial. Then, if you want to give these exported images and videos a particular file name, you can enter that here. Otherwise, the file name will include the word default. I'm going to rename this as Highway 1. For the output quality, you can choose between a few 16:9 resolution presets, including 1080p, 4K, and 8K. As I toggle between these, the number of pixels in the XY resolution settings are changing, but still keeping that ratio of 16 wide by 9 tall. Generally, if you're going to print an image on a large poster board or show a video on a large monitor, I would go with a 4K or maybe even 8K output size for a higher quality image. But keep in mind that higher resolution will mean larger output file sizes and longer rendering times. For smaller brochures, proposal images, or web page images, a 1080p quality might be acceptable as well. You can see the aspect ratio, or actual size and shape of the render output, by toggling on the preview aspect ratio setting. Since my Beyond Typicals window is full screen and my monitor is an exact 16 wide to 9 tall ratio, what I see is what I'll get with these resolution shortcuts. But if I want a custom shape or resolution, I can change the X and Y resolution to increase or decrease the number of pixels for the height and width of the output. When I do that, black bars will appear on my screen. For example, if I want a 4K quality image that's square, I can increase the Y resolution to match the width of 3,840 pixels. Those black bars on the left and right means that that area of my screen won't be rendered, leaving me with a square-shaped output. And keep in mind, this render menu can sometimes get in the way of what would be in the render, so go ahead and pull that back to frame up and center your shot. If you toggle off preview aspect ratio, those black bars disappear, but the resulting image will still be that square shape from the X and Y resolution settings. There is a quality samples per frame spin bar here as well. This is set at 3 by default and generally doesn't need to be adjusted. This setting controls how many samples are being taken of each frame that's being rendered, and things like lighting, reflectivity, and anti-aliasing are balanced for each frame. Reducing this setting would result in shorter render times, but a higher value produces a crisper, cleaner output. We set this default in the middle for a balance of both. The settings section below that are for video renders, where you can change the number of seconds of the video render up to 60 seconds. You can also choose between some preset frame rates. The options are 24, 30, 60, and 120 frames per second. Higher frame rates produce smoother videos, but take longer to render and create larger file sizes. I typically render at 30 or 60 FPS. There's also a couple of video format options, which I usually leave as MP4, and you can also choose an MP4 quality setting between low, standard, high, and very high. Again, keep in mind that the longer the video and higher quality settings will take longer to render and create larger files on your computer. I suggest testing a few different options on your first few projects to find a good balance between render time and output quality. At the very bottom, we have our render buttons. After adjusting all the settings above this section, we're now ready to either take a screenshot render, which will produce a static PNG image of the model, or record an animated video. I'll first go ahead and just press screenshot to render a still image of this model. After clicking screenshot, Beyond Typicals enters the render pipeline to record the samples and produce an image render. When finished, there's a pop-up in the middle of the screen with a shortcut to open the folder where the image was saved. I'll click that button to pull up the output folder where I can see the PNG image that was recorded. Notice that the image is a square as I had set that with my X and Y resolution settings, but also that these vehicles are blurry. Rendering an image with moving traffic will cause a motion blur, so it's best practice to pause traffic before taking any screenshot renders. After pausing the traffic, I'll take another screenshot render, but this time choose Screenshot with Transparency. This is a second image render option, which instead of rendering the complete image we see here with the blue sky background, we get two images, where the background is separated from the model elements. This default layer PNG has a transparent background. This is a good option for layering your image on a website or project brochure where you may not want that gradient background to appear. Now I'll record a video of the model and combine a few of the other features I've discussed in this video. First, I'm going to unpause traffic, then change this back to a 4K 16:9 resolution and turn on auto phasing and set that interval to change phases every 6 seconds. Then I'm going to change the video length to 10 seconds and load my saved pan right camera position, then click record video. Again, Beyond Typicals heads into that render pipeline, and this time it will take a few minutes to record that MP4 video, which will change from the existing condition phase to the construction phase partway into the record. As this is rendering, you can see the render preview to see what is being recorded, and the status at the bottom shows things like the number of frames being rendered and an estimated time until completion. If for any reason you wanted to stop the render in progress, you can click the Cancel Render button in the bottom right. While this finishes up, I'll note a few limitations of Beyond Typical's rendering. First, you can't yet create videos with alpha transparency, so any video renders will have the gradient background. There are also some limitations and important notes with rendering in the 2D camera mode. For starters, you aren't able to record a video while in 2D view, and you can't render a 2D image with a transparent background even though it may appear that option is available. Screenshot rendering in the 2D camera mode also doesn't enter the same render pipeline, so you don't get the preview box and pop-up message saying the render is finished. After clicking Screenshot in 2D camera mode, just head to the output folder to find that image. There's some other known bugs and limitations with rendering which can be found in the Known Issues document available in the Help pulldown. Now it looks like the video render's finished, as I can see that message that includes a button to open the folder which contains the video. You can elect to stop this message from appearing, but I like to leave it on as a quick link back to my completed project. Let's open that video to see what it looks like. I'll note that for any advanced video effects, you could pull these MP4 renders into a simple video editing tool like Clipchamp or Adobe Premiere Rush and do things like add title cards, transitions, and music tracks, similar to how I've put these tutorial videos together, and turn your project graphics into a really special product. Here's a quick example of taking some Beyond Typical's video renders into a video editing app and adding some notes and transitions to walk through some design options of a road safety improvement. That does it for part 2 of our video tutorial series, showing you the basics of how to use Beyond Typicals. Join me in our next video where I show you how to build and edit sections on your way to creating beautiful 3D rendered typical sections for your transportation project.